R-K selection theory. In ecology, R-K selection theory relates to the selection of combinations of traits in an organism that trade off between quantity and quality of offspring. The focus on either an increased quantity of offspring at the expense of reduced individual parental investment of R strategists, or on a reduced quantity of offspring with a corresponding increased parental investment of K strategists, varies widely, seemingly to promote success in particular environments. The concepts of quantity or quality offspring are sometimes referred to as cheap or expensive, a comment on the expendable nature of the offspring and parental commitment made. 1. The stability of the environment can predict if many expendable offspring are made or if fewer offspring of higher quality would lead to higher reproductive success. An unstable environment would encourage the parent to make many offspring, because the likelihood of all, or the majority, of them surviving to adulthood is slim. In contrast, more stable environments allow parents to confidently invest in one offspring because they are more likely to survive to adulthood. A North Atlantic right whale with solitary calf. Whale reproduction follows a K selection strategy, with few offspring, long gestation, long parental care, and a long period until sexual maturity. The terminology of R-K selection was coined by the ecologists Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson in 1967, 2. Based on their work on island biogeography. 3. Although the concept of the evolution of life history strategies has a longer history. 4. C.E.G. plant strategies. The theory was popular in the 1970s and 1980s, when it was used as a heuristic device, but lost importance in the early 1990s, when it was criticized by several empirical studies. 5. 6. A life history paradigm has replaced the R-K selection paradigm, but continues to incorporate its important themes as a subset of life history theory. 7. Some scientists now prefer to use the terms fast versus slow life history as a replacement for, respectively, R versus K reproductive strategy. 8. A litter of rats with their mother. The reproduction of rats follows an R selection strategy, with many offspring, short gestation, less parental care, and a short time until sexual maturity. The same applies to mice. In R-K selection theory, selective pressures are hypothesized to drive evolution in one of two generalized directions, R-K selection. 2. These terms, R and K, are drawn from standard ecological formula as illustrated in the simplified Verhulst model of population dynamics, 9. Where N is the population, R is the maximum growth rate, K is the carrying capacity of the local environment, and Dn. dt, the derivative of population size n with respect to time t, is the rate of change in population with time. Thus, the equation relates the growth rate of the population n to the current population size, incorporating the effect of the two constant parameters R and K. Note that when the population size is greater than the carrying capacity then 1 and K is negative, which indicates a population decline or negative growth. The choice of the letter K came from the German Kapazitätsgrenze, capacity limit, while R came from rate. R selection. R-selected species are those that emphasize high growth rates, typically exploit less crowded ecological niches, and produce many offspring, each of which has a relatively low probability of surviving to adulthood, i.e., high R, low K. 10. A typical R species is the dandelion, genus Taraxacum. Overview. In unstable or unpredictable environments, R selection predominates due to the ability to reproduce rapidly. There is little advantage in adaptations that permit successful competition with other organisms, because the environment is likely to change again. Among the traits that are thought to characterize R selection are high fecundity, small body size, early maturity onset, short generation time, and the ability to disperse offspring widely. Organisms whose life history is subject to R selection are often referred to as R strategists or R selected. Organisms that exhibit R-selected traits can range from bacteria and diatoms, to insects and grasses, to various Semelparous cephalopods, certain families of birds, such as dabbling ducks, and small mammals, particularly rodents. K selection. A bald eagle, an individual of a typical K strategist species. K strategists have longer life expectancies. By contrast, K-selected species display traits associated with living at densities close to carrying capacity and typically are strong competitors in such crowded niches that invest more heavily in fewer offspring, each of which has a relatively high probability of surviving to adulthood, i.e., low R, high K. In scientific literature, R-selected species are occasionally referred to as opportunistic, whereas K-selected species are described as equilibrium. 10. In stable or predictable environments, K-selection predominates as the ability to compete successfully for limited resources is crucial and populations of K-selected organisms typically are very constant in number and close to the maximum that the environment can bear, unlike R-selected populations, where population sizes can change much more rapidly. Traits that are thought to be characteristic of K-selection include large body size, long life expectancy, and the production of fewer offspring, which often require Traits that are thought to be characteristic of In stable or predictable environments, K-selection predominates as the ability to compete successfully for limited resources is crucial, and populations of K-selected organisms typically are very constant in number and close to the maximum that the environment can bear, unlike R-selected populations, where population sizes can change much more rapidly. Traits that are thought to be characteristic of K-selection include large body size, long life expectancy, and the production of fewer offspring, which often require extensive parental care until they mature. Organisms whose life history is subject to K-selection are often referred to as K-strategists or K-selected. 11. Organisms with K-selected traits include large organisms such as elephants, humans, and whales, but also smaller long-lived organisms such as Arctic terns, 12 parrots, and eagles. Continuous spectrum. Although some organisms are identified as primarily rare K-strategists, the majority of organisms do not follow this pattern. For instance, trees have traits such as longevity and strong competitiveness that characterize them as K-strategists. In reproduction, however, trees typically produce thousands of offspring and disperse them widely, traits characteristic of R-strategists. 13. Similarly, reptiles such as sea turtles display both rare and K traits. Although sea turtles are large organisms with long lifespans, provided they reach adulthood, they produce large numbers of unnurtured offspring. The R-K dichotomy can be re-expressed as a continuous spectrum using the economic concept of discounted future returns, with R selection corresponding to large discount rates and K selection corresponding to small discount rates. 14. Ecological succession. In areas of major ecological disruption or sterilization, such as after a major volcanic eruption, as at Krakatoa or Mount St. Helens, rare and K strategists play distinct roles in the ecological succession that regenerates the ecosystem. Because of their higher reproductive rates and ecological opportunism, primary colonizers typically are R-strategists, and they are followed by a succession of increasingly competitive flora and fauna. The ability of an environment to increase energetic content through photosynthetic. In unstable or unpredictable environments, traits that are thought to be characteristic of K-selection include large body size, long life expectancy, and the production of fewer offspring, which often require extensive parental care until they mature. Organisms whose life history is subject to K-selection are often referred to as K-strategists or K-selected. 11. Organisms with K-selected traits include large organisms such as elephants, humans, and whales, but also smaller long-lived organisms such as Arctic terns, 12 parrots, and eagles. Continuous spectrum. Although some organisms are identified as primarily rare K-strategists, the majority of organisms do not follow this pattern. For instance, trees have traits such as longevity and strong competitiveness that characterize them as K-strategists. In reproduction, however, trees typically produce thousands of offspring and disperse them widely, traits characteristic of R-strategists. 13. Similarly, reptiles such as sea turtles display both rare and K traits. Although sea turtles are large organisms with long lifespans, provided they reach adulthood, they produce large numbers of unnurtured offspring. The R-K dichotomy can be re-expressed as a continuous spectrum using the economic concept of discounted future returns, with R selection corresponding to large discount rates and K selection corresponding to small discount rates. 14. Ecological succession. In areas of reproduction, continuous spectrum. Although some organisms are identified as primarily rare K-strategists, the majority of organisms do not follow this pattern. For instance, trees have traits such as longevity and strong competitiveness that characterize them as K-strategists. In reproduction, however, trees typically produce thousands of offspring and disperse them widely, traits characteristic of R-strategists. 13. Similarly, reptiles such as sea turtles display both rare and K traits. Although sea turtles are large organisms with long lifespans, provided they reach adulthood, they produce large numbers of unnurtured offspring. The R The R-K dichotomy can be re-expressed as a continuous spectrum using the economic concept of discounted future returns, with R selection corresponding to large discount rates and K selection corresponding to small discount rates. 14. Ecological succession. In areas of major ecological disruption or sterilization, such as after a major volcanic eruption, as at Krakatoa or Mount St. Helens, rare and K strategists play distinct roles in the ecological succession that regenerates the ecosystem. Because of their higher reproductive rates and ecological opportunism, primary colonizers typically are R-strategists, and they are followed by a succession of increasingly competitive flora and fauna. The ability of an environment to increase energetic content, through photosynthetic capture of solar energy, increases with the increase in complex biodiversity as R species proliferate to reach a peak possible with K strategies. 15. Eventually a new equilibrium is approached, sometimes referred to as a climax community, with R-strategists gradually being replaced by K-strategists, which are more competitive and better adapted to the emerging micro-environmental characteristics of the landscape. Traditionally, biodiversity was considered maximized at this stage, with introductions of new species resulting in the replacement and local extinction of endemic species. 16. However, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis posits that intermediate levels of disturbance in a landscape create patches at different levels of succession, promoting coexistence of colonizers and competitors at the regional scale. Application. While usually applied at the level of species, RK selection theory is also useful in studying the evolution of ecological and life history differences between subspecies, for instance the African honeybee, A.M. scutellata, and the Italian bee, A.M. ligustica. 17. At the other end of the scale, it has also been used to study the evolutionary ecology of whole groups of organisms, such as bacteriophages. 18. Other researchers have proposed that the evolution of human inflammatory responses is related to RK selection. 19. Some researchers, such as Lee Ellis, J. Philippe Rushton, and Aurelio José Figueiredo, have attempted to apply RK selection theory to various human behaviors, including crime, 20, sexual promiscuity, fertility, IQ, and other traits related to life history theory. 21-22 Rushton developed differential K theory to attempt to explain variations in behavior across human races. 22-23 Differential K theory has been debunked as being devoid of empirical basis, and has also been described as a key example of scientific racism. 24-25-26 Status. Although RK selection theory became widely used during the 1970s, 27, 28, 29, 30, it also began to attract more critical attention. 31, 32, 33, 34, in particular, a review in 1977 by the ecologist Stephen C. Stearns drew attention to gaps in the theory, and to ambiguities in the interpretation of empirical data for testing it. 35. In 1981, a review of the RK selection literature by Perry demonstrated that there was no agreement among researchers using the theory about the definition of RandK selection, which led him to question whether the assumption of a relation between reproductive expenditure and packaging of offspring was justified. 36. A 1982 study by Templeton and Johnson showed that in a population of Drosophila mercatorum under K selection the population actually produced a higher frequency of traits typically associated with R selection. 37. Several other studies contradicting the predictions of RK selection theory were also published between 1977 and 1994. 38, 39, 40, 41. When Stearns reviewed the status of the theory again in 1992, 42, he noted that from 1977 to 1982 there was an average of 42 references to the theory per year in the Biosis Literature Search Service, but from 1984 to 1989 the average dropped to 16 per year and continued to decline. He concluded that RK theory was a once useful heuristic that no longer serves a purpose in life history theory. 43. More recently, the Panarchy theories of adaptive capacity and resilience promoted by C.S. Halling and Lance Gunderson have revived interest in the theory, and use it as a way of integrating social systems, economics, and ecology. 44. Writing in 2002, Resnick and colleagues reviewed the controversy regarding RK selection theory and concluded that the distinguishing feature of the RandK selection paradigm was the focus on density-dependent selection as the important agent of selection on organisms' life histories. This paradigm was challenged as it became clear that other factors, such as age-specific mortality, could provide a more mechanistic causative link between an environment and an optimal life history. Wilbur et al. 1974, 31, Stearns 1976, 45, 1977, 35. The R and K selection paradigm was replaced by new paradigm that focused in age-specific mortality. Stearns, 1976, 45, Charlesworth, 1980, 46. This new life history paradigm has matured into one that uses age-structured models as a framework to incorporate many of the themes important to the RK paradigm. Resnick, Bryant, and Bashi, 2002, 7. Alternative approaches are now available both for studying life history evolution, e.g. Leslie matrix for an age-structured population, and for density-dependent selection, e.g. variable density lottery model, 47. Similparity and heteroparity. Similparity and heteroparity are two contrasting reproductive strategies available to living organisms. A species is considered similparous if it is characterized by a single reproductive episode before death, and heteroparous if it is characterized by multiple reproductive cycles over the course of its lifetime. Heteroparity can be further divided into continuous heteroparity primates, including humans and chimpanzees, and seasonal heteroparity birds, dogs, etc. Some botanists use the parallel terms monocarpy and polycarpy. See also Pliotegales. In truly similparous species, death after reproduction is part of an overall strategy that includes putting all available resources into maximizing reproduction, at the expense of future life. See section trade-offs. In any heteroparous population there will be some individuals who happen to die after their first and before any second reproductive episode, but unless this is part of a syndrome of programmed death after reproduction, this would not be called similparity. This distinction is also related to the difference between annual and perennial plants. An annual is a plant that completes its life cycle in a single season, and is usually similparous. Perennials live for more than one season and are usually, but not always, heteroparous. 1. Similparity and heteroparity are not, strictly speaking, alternative strategies, but extremes along a continuum of possible modes of reproduction. Many organisms considered to be similparous can, under certain conditions, separate their single bout of reproduction into 2 or more episodes. 2, 3. Overview. Pacific salmon are examples of similparous organisms. Similparity. The word, similparity, was coined by evolutionary biologist Lamont Cole, and comes from the Latin semel once, a single time, and pario, to beget. This differs from heteroparity in that heteroparous species are able to have multiple reproductive cycles and therefore The word, semilperiti, was coined by evolutionary biologist Lamont Cole, for and comes from the Latin semel once, a single time, and perio, to beget. This differs from Iduroperity in that Iduroperous species are able to have multiple reproductive cycles and therefore can mate more than once in their lifetime. Semilperity is also known as Big Bang reproduction, since the single reproductive event of semilperous organisms is usually large as well as fatal. 5. A classic example of a semilperous organism is most Pacific salmon, Oncorhynchus spp, which live for many years in the ocean before swimming to the freshwater stream of its birth, spawning, and dying. Other semilperous animals include many insects, including some species of butterflies, cicadas, and mayflies, many arachnids, and some mollusks such as some species of squid and octopus. Semilperity also occurs in smelt and capelin, but other than bony fish it is a very rare strategy in vertebrates. In amphibians, it is known only among some hylofrogs including the gladiator frog. 6. In reptiles only a few lizards such as Labrad's chameleon of southwestern Madagascar. 7. Sceliporus picanthalus of the high mountains of Mexico. 8. And some species of Ichnotropus from dry savanna areas of Africa. 9. Among mammals, it exists only in a few didelphid and dossierid marsupials. 10. Annual plants, including all grain crops and most domestic vegetables, are semilperous. Long-lived semilperous plants include century plant, agave, Lobelia telekii, and some species of bamboo. 11. This form of lifestyle is consistent with our selected strategies as many offspring are produced and there is low parental input, as one or both parents die after mating. All of the male's energy is diverting into mating and the immune system is repressed. High levels of corticosteroids are sustained over long periods of time. This triggers immune and inflammatory system failure and gastrointestinal hemorrhage, which eventually leads to death. 12. Semilperity also occurs in smelt and capelin, but other than bony fish it is a very rare strategy in vertebrates. In amphibians, it is known only among some hylofrogs including the gladiator frog. 6. In reptiles only a few lizards such as Labrad's chameleon of southwestern Madagascar. 7. Sceliporus picanthalus of the high mountains of Mexico. 8. And some species of Ichnotropus from dry savanna areas of Africa. 9. Among mammals, it exists only in a few didelphid and dossierid marsupials. 10. Annual plants, including all grain crops and most domestic vegetables, are semilperous. Long-lived semilperous plants include century plant, agave, Lobelia telekii, and some species of bamboo. 11. This form of lifestyle is consistent with our selected strategies as many offspring are produced and there is low parental input, as one or both parents die after mating. All of the male's energy is diverting into mating and the immune system is repressed. High levels of corticosteroids are sustained over long periods of time. This triggers immune and inflammatory system failure and gastrointestinal hemorrhage, which eventually leads to death. 12. Iduroperity. An iduroperous organism is one that can undergo many reproductive events throughout its lifetime. The pig is an example of an iduroperous organism. The term iduroperity comes from the Latin itero, to repeat, and perio, to beget. An example of an iduroperous organism is a human. Humans are biologically capable of having offspring many times over the course of their lives. Iduroperous vertebrates include all birds, most reptiles, virtually all mammals, and most fish. Among invertebrates, most mollusca and many insects, for example, mosquitoes and cockroaches, are iduroperous. Most perennial plants are iduroperous. Models. Trade-offs. It is a biological precept that within its lifetime an organism has a limited amount of energy, resources available to it, and must always partition it among various functions such as collecting food and finding a mate. Of relevance here is the trade-off between fecundity, growth, and survivorship in its life history strategy. These trade-offs come into play in the evolution of iduroperity and semilperity. It has been repeatedly demonstrated that semilperous species produce more offspring in their single fatal reproductive episode than do closely related iduroperous species in any one of theirs. It has been repeatedly demonstrated that semilperous species produce more offspring in their single fatal reproductive episode than do closely related iduroperous species in any one of theirs. However, the opportunity to reproduce more than once in a lifetime, and possibly with greater care for the development of offspring produced, can offset this strictly numerical benefit. Models based on nonlinear trade-offs. One class of models that tries to explain the differential evolution of semilperity and iduroperity examines the shape of the trade-off. One class of models that tries to explain the differential evolution of semilperity and iduroperity examines the shape of the trade-off between offspring produced and offspring foregone. In economic terms, offspring produced is equivalent to a benefit function, while offspring foregone is comparable to a cost function. The reproductive effort of an organism, the proportion of energy that it puts into reproducing, as opposed to growth or survivorship, occurs at the point where the distance between offspring produced and offspring foregone is the greatest. 13. Iduroperous reproductive effort. In some situations, the marginal cost of offspring produced decreases over time. Each additional offspring is less expensive than the average of all previous offspring, and the marginal cost of offspring foregone increases. In these cases, the organism only devotes a portion of its resources to reproduction and uses the rest for growth and survivorship so that it can reproduce again in the future. 14. Semilperous reproductive effort. In other situations, the marginal cost of offspring produced increases while the marginal cost of offspring foregone decreases. When this is the case, it is favorable for the organism to reproduce a single time. The individual devotes all of its resources to that one episode of reproduction, then dies as it has not reserved enough resources to meet its own ongoing survival needs. Empirical, quantitative support for this mathematical model is limited. Bet hedging models. A second set of models examines the possibility that idroparity is a hedge against unpredictable juvenile survivorship, avoiding putting all one's eggs in one basket. Again, mathematical models have not found empirical support from real-world systems. In fact, many Semelparous species live in habitats characterized by high, not low, environmental unpredictability, such as deserts and early successional habitats. Cole's paradox and demographic models. The models that have the strongest support from living systems are demographic. In Lamont Cole's classic 1954 paper, he came to the conclusion that for an annual species, the absolute gain in intrinsic population growth which could be achieved by changing to the perennial reproductive habit would be exactly equivalent to adding one individual to the average litter size. 15. For example, imagine two species, an Idroparous species that has annual litters averaging 3 offspring each, and a Semelparous species that has one litter of 4, and then dies. These two species have the same rate of population growth, which suggests that even a tiny fecundity advantage of one additional offspring would favor the evolution of Semelparity. This is known as Cole's paradox. In his analysis, Cole assumed that there was no mortality of individuals of the Idroparous species, even seedlings. 20 years later, Charnov and Schaefer 16 showed that reasonable differences in adult and juvenile mortality yield much more reasonable costs of Semelparity, essentially solving Cole's paradox. An even more general demographic model was produced by Young. 17. These demographic models have been more successful than the other models when tested with real-world systems. It has been shown that Semelparous species have higher expected adult mortality, making it more economical to put all reproductive effort into the first, and therefore final, reproductive episode. 18-19. Semelparity. Semelparity in mammals. Antechinus agilis. In Dasyuridae. Small Dasyuridae. Phascogale calora. Semelparous species of Dasyuridae are typically small and carnivorous, with the exception of the northern quoll, Dasyurus halicatus, which is large. Species with this reproductive strategy include members of the genus Antechinus, Phascogale topotapha and Phascogale coolura. The males of all three groups exhibit similar characteristics that classify them as Semelparous. First, all of the males of each species disappear immediately after the mating season. Also, males that are captured and isolated from others live for 2 to 3 years. 20. If these captured males are allowed to mate, they die immediately after the mating season, like those in the wild. Their behavior also changes drastically before and after the mating season. Before mating, males are extremely aggressive and will fight with other males if placed close together. Males that are captured before they are allowed to mate remain aggressive through the winter months. After the mating season, if allowed to mate, males become extremely lethargic and never regain their aggressiveness even if they survive to the next mating season. 20. Other changes that occur post-mating include fur degradation and testicular degeneration. During adolescence, male fur is thick and becomes dull and thin after mating, but regains its original condition if the individual manages to survive past the mating season. The fur on the scrotum completely falls off and does not grow back, even if the male survives months after the first mating season. As the marsupial ages, its testicles grow until they reach a peak size and weight at the beginning of the mating season. After the individual mates, the weight and size of the testes and scrotum decrease. They remain small and do not produce spermatozoa later in life, if maintained in a laboratory. 20. The 1966 Woolley study on Antechinus spp. Noticed that males were only able to be maintained past mating in the laboratory, and no senile males were found in the wild, suggesting that all males die shortly after mating. 20. Corticosteroid concentration and increased male mortality. Antechinus Stewart E. Studies on Antechinus Stewart E reveal that male mortality is highly correlated to stress and adrenocortical activity. The study measured the corticosteroid concentration in males in the wild, males injected with cortisol, males injected with saline, and females in the wild. While both males and females exhibit high levels of corticosteroid concentration in the wild, this proves fatal only to males due to females having a higher maximum high-affinity corticosteroid binding capacity (MCBC). 21. Thus, free corticosteroid in the plasma of male Stewart E rises sharply, while it remains constant in females. High levels of free corticosteroid, resulting from mating in wild males and injected cortisol in laboratory males, resulted in stomach ulcers, gastrointestinal bleeding, and liver abscesses, all of which increased mortality. These side effects were not found in the males that were injected with saline. 21. Strengthening the hypothesis that high, free corticosteroids result in higher mortality in male Dasyurids. A similar study on Phascogale calora showed that similar endocrine system changes happened in P. calora as a Stewart E. 22. This supports stress-induced mortality as a characteristic of small Dasyurid Semelparity. Large Dasyuridae. Dasyurus halicatus. Dasyurus halicatus, the northern quoll, is a large dasyurid and exhibits increased male mortality after the mating season. Unlike smaller dasyurids, male die-off in D. halicatus is not due to endocrine system changes, and there was no observed spermatogenic failure after the mating season ended. 12. If male D. halicatus survive past their first mating season, they may be able to engage in a second mating season. While the individuals in a 2001 study mostly died from vehicles or predation, researchers found evidence of physiological degradation in males, similar to the physiological degradation in small dasyurids. This includes fur loss, parasite infestations, and weight loss. As the mating period went on, males became increasingly anemic, but the anemia was not due to ulceration or gastrointestinal bleeding. 12. Lack of elevated cortisol levels during mating periods in D. halicatus means that there is no current universal explanation for the mechanism behind increased male mortality in docility. Post-reproductive senescence has also been proposed as an explanation. 23. In opossums. Marmosops incanus. Gray slender mouse opossum, Marmosops incanus. The gray slender mouse opossum exhibits a simulparous reproductive strategy in both males and females. Males disappear from their endemic area after the reproductive season, February-May. Males found months later, June-August, are of lighter body weight and the molar teeth are less worn down, suggesting these males belong to a different generation. There is a drop-off in the female population, but during the months of July and August, evidence of a gap between generations like the male gap. There is also lower body weight and less molar wear observed in females found after August. This is further supported by the evidence that females that reproduce are not observed the following year. 24. This species has been compared to a related species, Marmosa robinsoni, in order to answer what would happen if a female that has reproduced were to survive to the next mating season. M. robinsoni has a monoestrous reproductive cycle, like M. incanus, and females are no longer fertile after 17 months, so it is unlikely that females that survive past the drop-off in female populations would be able to reproduce a second time. 24. Other mouse opossums. Gracilinanus microtarsus. Gracilinanus microtarsus, or the Brazilian gracile opossum, is considered to be partially simulparous because male mortality increases significantly after the mating season, but some males survive to mate again in the next reproductive cycle. The males also exhibit similar physiological degradation, demonstrated in Antechinus and other simulparous marsupials, such as fur loss and increase of infection from parasites. 25. Simulparity in fish. Pacific salmon. Highly elevated cortisol levels mediate the post-spawning death of Simulparous oncorhynchus Pacific salmon by causing tissue degeneration, suppressing the immune system, and impairing various homeostatic mechanisms. 26. After swimming for such a long distance, salmon expend all of their energy on reproduction. One of the key factors in salmon rapid senescence is that these fish do not feed during reproduction, so body weight is extremely reduced. 27. In addition to physiological degradation, Pacific salmon become more lethargic as mating goes on, which makes some individuals more susceptible to predation because they have less energy to avoid predators. 28. This also increases mortality rates of adults post-mating. Simulparity in insects. Spongy moth. Traditionally, simulparity was usually defined within the time frame of a year. Critics of this criterion note that this scale is inappropriate in discussing patterns of insect reproduction because many insects breed more than once within one annual period, but generation times of less than 1 year. Under the traditional definition, insects are considered simulparous as a consequence of time scale rather than the distribution of reproductive effort over their adult lifespan. 29. In order to resolve this inconsistency, Fritz, Stamp and Halverson 1982 define simulparous insects as insects that lay a single clutch of eggs in their lifetime and deposit them at one place are clearly simulparous or Big Bang reproducers. Their entire reproductive effort is committed at one time and they die shortly after oviposition. 29. Simulparous insects are found in Lepidoptera, Ephemeroptera, Dermaptera, Plecoptera, Strepsiptera, Trichoptera, and Hemiptera. Examples in Lepidoptera. Females of certain families of Lepidoptera, like the spongy moth of family Erebidae, have reduced mobility or are wingless apteris, so they disperse in the larval stage as opposed to in the adult stage. In Iteroporous insects, dispersal mainly occurs in the adult stage. All simulparous lepidopterans share similar characteristics. Larvae only feed in restricted periods of the year because of the nutritional state of their host plants. As a result, their unovoltine initial food supply is predictably abundant, and larval host plants are abundant and adjacent. 29. Death most commonly occurs by starvation. In the case of the spongy moth, adults do not possess an active digestive system and cannot feed, but can drink moisture. Mating occurs fairly rapidly after adults emerge from their pupal foramen. Without a way to digest food, the adult moths die after about a week. 30. Evolutionary advantages to simulparity. Current evolutionary advantages hypothesis. Antechinus agilis showing offspring inside pouch. The evolution for simulparity in both sexes has occurred many times in plants, invertebrates, and fish. It is rare in mammals because mammals have obligate maternal care due to internal fertilization and incubation of offspring and nursing young after birth, which requires high maternal survival rate after fertilization and offspring weaning. Also, female mammals have relatively low reproductive rates compared to invertebrates or fish because they invest a lot of energy in maternal care. However, male reproductive rate is much less constrained in mammals because only females bear young. A male that dies after one mating season can still produce a large number of offspring if he invests all of his energy in mating with many females. 31. Evolution in mammals. Scientists have hypothesized that natural selection has allowed simulparity to evolve in Docierity and Didelphidi because of certain ecological constraints. Female mammals ancestral to these groups may have shortened their mating period to coincide with peak prey abundance. Because this window is so small, the females of these species exhibit a reproduction pattern where the estrus of all females occurs simultaneously. Selection would then favor aggressive males due to increased competition between males for access to females. Evolution in mammals. Scientists have hypothesized that natural selection has allowed simulparity to evolve in Docierity and Didelphidi because of certain ecological constraints. Female mammals ancestral to these groups may have shortened their mating period to coincide with peak prey abundance. Because this window is so small, the females of these species exhibit a reproduction pattern where the estrus of all females occurs simultaneously. Selection would then favor aggressive males due to increased competition between males for access to females. Since the mating period is so short, it is more beneficial for males to expend all their energy on mating, even more so if they are unlikely to survive to the next mating season. 32. Evolution in fish. Dead salmon after spawning. Reproduction is costly for anadromous salmonids, because their life history requires transition from saltwater to freshwater streams, and long migrations, which can be physiologically taxing. The transition between cold oceanic water to warm freshwater and steep elevation changes in northern Pacific rivers could explain the evolution of Semmelparity because it would be extremely difficult to return to the ocean. A noticeable difference between Semmelparous fish and Iduroparous salmonids is that egg size varies between the two types of reproductive strategies. Studies show that egg size is also affected by migration and body size. Egg number, however, shows little variation between Semmelparous and Iduroparous populations or between resident and anadromous populations for females of the same body size. 33. The current hypothesis behind this reason is that Iduroparous species reduce the size of their eggs in order to improve the mother's chances of survival, since she invests less energy in gamete formation. Semmelparous species do not expect to live past one mating season, so females invest a lot more energy in gamete formation resulting in large eggs. Anadromous salmonids may also have evolved Semmelparity to boost the nutrition density of the spawning grounds. The most productive Pacific salmon spawning grounds contain the most carcasses of spawned adults. The dead bodies of the adult salmon decompose and provide nitrogen and phosphorus for algae to grow in the nutrient-poor water. Zooplankton then feed on the algae, and newly hatched salmon feed on the zooplankton. 34. Evolution in insects. Earwig guarding eggs. An interesting trait has evolved in Semmelparous insects, especially in those that have evolved from parasitic ancestors, like in all subsocial and eusocial Aculete Hymenoptera. This is because larvae are morphologically specialized for development within a host's innards and thus are entirely helpless outside of that environment. Females would need to invest a lot of energy in protecting their eggs and hatched offspring. They do this through such behaviors as egg guarding. Mothers that actively defend offspring, for example, risk injury or death by doing so. 35. This is not beneficial in an Iduroparous species because the female risks dying and not reaching her full reproductive potential by not being able to reproduce in all reproductive periods in her lifetime. Since Semmelparous insects only live for one reproductive cycle, they can afford to expend energy on maternal care because those offspring are her only offspring. An Iduroparous insect does not need to expend energy on the eggs of one mating period because it is likely that she will mate again. There is ongoing research in maternal care in Semmelparous insects from lineages not descended from parasites to further understand this relationship between Semmelparity and maternal care. Coevolution. In biology, coevolution occurs when two or more species reciprocally affect each other's evolution through the process of natural selection. The term sometimes is used for two traits in the same species affecting each other's evolution, as well as gene culture coevolution. The pollinating wasp Dicyscalea ciliata in pseudocopulation with a flower of Ophrys speculum. 1. Charles Darwin mentioned evolutionary interactions between flowering plants and insects in On the Origin of Species, 1859. Although he did not use the word coevolution, he suggested how plants and insects could evolve through reciprocal evolutionary changes. Naturalists in the late 1800s studied other examples of how interactions among species could result in reciprocal evolutionary change. Beginning in the 1940s, plant pathologists developed breeding programs that were examples of human-induced coevolution. Development of new crop plant varieties that were resistant to some diseases favored rapid evolution in pathogen populations to overcome those plant defenses. That, in turn, required the development of yet new resistant crop plant varieties, producing an ongoing cycle of reciprocal evolution in crop plants and diseases that continues to this day. Coevolution is a major topic for study in nature expanded rapidly from the 1960s, when Daniel H. Janssen showed coevolution between acacias and ants, see below, and Paul R. Ehrlich and Peter H. Raven suggested how coevolution between plants and butterflies may have contributed to the diversification of species in both groups. The theoretical underpinnings of coevolution are now well developed, e.g., the geographic mosaic theory of coevolution, and demonstrate that coevolution can play an important role in driving major evolutionary transitions such as the evolution of sexual reproduction or shifts in ploidy. 2. 3. More recently, it has also been demonstrated that coevolution can influence the structure and function of ecological communities, the evolution of groups of mutualists such as plants and their pollinators, and the dynamics of infectious disease. 2. 4. Each party in a coevolutionary relationship exerts selective pressures on the other, thereby affecting each other's evolution. Coevolution includes many forms of mutualism, host-parasite, and predator-prey relationships between species, as well as competition within or between species. In many cases, the selective pressures drive an evolutionary arms race between the species involved. Pairwise or specific coevolution, between exactly two species, is not the only possibility, in multi-species coevolution, which is sometimes called guild or diffuse coevolution, several to many. Species may evolve a trait or a group of traits in reciprocity with a set of traits in another species, as has happened between the flowering plants and pollinating insects such as bees, flies, and beetles. There are a suite of specific hypotheses on the mechanisms by which groups of species coevolve with each other. 5. Coevolution is primarily a biological concept, but researchers have applied it by analogy to fields such as computer science, sociology, and astronomy. Mutualism. Coevolution is the evolution of two or more species which reciprocally affect each other, sometimes creating a mutualistic relationship between the species. Such relationships can be of many different types. 6, 7. Flowering plants. Flowers appeared and diversified relatively suddenly in the fossil record, creating what Charles Darwin described as a abominable mystery of how they had evolved so quickly. He considered whether coevolution could be the explanation. 8, 9. He first mentioned coevolution as a possibility and on the origin of species, and developed the concept further in fertilization of orchids. 1862. 7, 10, 11. Insects and insect-pollinated flowers. Honeybee taking a reward of nectar and collecting pollen in its pollen baskets from white melilla flowers. Modern insect-pollinated entomophilous flowers are conspicuously co-adapted with insects to ensure pollination and in return to reward the pollinators with nectar and pollen. The two groups have co-evolved for over 100 million years, creating a complex network of interactions. Either they evolved together, or at some later stages they came together, likely with pre-adaptations, and became mutually adapted. 12, 13. Several highly successful insect groups, especially the Hymenoptera wasps, bees and ants, and Lepidoptera butterflies and moths, as well as many types of Diptera flies and Coleoptera beetles evolved in conjunction with flowering plants during the Cretaceous 145 to 66 million years ago. The earliest bees, important pollinators today, appeared in the early Cretaceous. 14. A group of wasps sister to the bees evolved at the same time as flowering plants, as did the Lepidoptera. 14. Further, all the major clades of bees first appeared between the Middle and Late Cretaceous, simultaneously with the adaptive radiation of the eudicots, 3/4 of all angiosperms, and at the time when the angiosperms became the world's dominant plants on land. 8. At least 3 aspects of flowers appear to have coevolved between flowering plants and insects, because they involve communication between these organisms. Firstly, flowers communicate with their pollinators by scent. Insects use this scent to determine how far away a flower is, to approach it, and to identify where to land and finally to feed. Secondly, flowers attract insects with patterns of stripes leading to the rewards of nectar and pollen, and colors such as blue and ultraviolet, to which their eyes are sensitive. In contrast, bird-pollinated flowers tend to be red or orange. Thirdly, flowers such as some orchids mimic females of particular insects, deceiving males into pseudocopulation. Thirdly, flowers such as some orchids mimic females of particular insects, deceiving males into pseudocopulation. 14, 1. The yucca, Yucca whippley, is pollinated exclusively by Tegodicula maculata, a yucca moth that depends on the yucca for survival. 15. The moth eats the seeds of the plant, while gathering pollen. The pollen has evolved to become very sticky, and remains on the mouth parts when the moth moves to the next flower. The yucca provides a place for the moth to lay its eggs, deep within the flower away from potential predators. 16. Birds and bird-pollinated flowers. Purple-throated carib feeding from and pollinating a flower. Hummingbirds and ornithophilous bird-pollinated flowers have evolved a mutualistic relationship. The flowers have nectar suited to the birds' diet, their color suits the birds' vision and their shape fits that of the birds' bills. The blooming times of the flowers have also been found to coincide with hummingbirds' breeding seasons. The floral characteristics of ornithophilous plants vary greatly among each other compared to closely related insect-pollinated species. These flowers also tend to be more ornate, complex, and showy than their insect-pollinated counterparts. It is generally agreed that plants formed coevolutionary relationships with insects first, and ornithophilous species diverged at a later time. There is not much scientific support for instances of the reverse of this divergence, from ornithophyly to insect pollination. The diversity in floral phenotype in ornithophilous species, and the relative consistency observed in bee-pollinated species can be attributed to the direction of the shift in pollinator preference. 17. Flowers have converged to take advantage of similar birds. 18. Flowers compete for pollinators, and adaptations reduce unfavorable effects of this competition. The fact that birds can fly during inclement weather makes them more efficient pollinators where bees and other insects would be inactive. Ornithophyly may have arisen for this reason in isolated environments with poor insect colonization or areas with plants which flower in the winter. 18. 19. Bird-pollinated flowers usually have higher volumes of nectar and higher sugar production than those pollinated by insects. 20. This meets the birds' high energy requirements, the most important determinants of flower choice. 20. In Mammullus, an increase in red pigment in petals and flower nectar volume noticeably reduces the proportion of pollination by bees as opposed to hummingbirds, while greater flower surface area increases bee pollination. Therefore, red pigments in the flowers of Mammullus cardinalis may function primarily to discourage bee visitation. 21. In Penstemon, flower traits that discourage bee pollination may be more influential on the flower's evolutionary change than pro-bird adaptations, but adaptation towards birds and away from bees can happen simultaneously. 22. However, some flowers such as Heliconia angusta appear not to be as specifically ornithophilous as had been supposed. The species is occasionally 151 visits in 120 hours of observation visited by Trigona stingless bees. These bees are largely pollen robbers in this case, but may also serve as pollinators. 23. Following their respective breeding seasons, several species of hummingbirds occur at the same locations in North America, and several hummingbird flowers bloom simultaneously in these habitats. These flowers have converged to a common morphology and color because these are effective at attracting the birds. Different lengths and curvatures of the corolla tubes can affect the efficiency of extraction in hummingbird species in relation to differences in bill morphology. Tubular flowers force a bird to orient its bill in a particular way when probing the flower, especially when the bill and corolla are both curved. This allows the plant to place pollen on a certain part of the bird's body, permitting a variety of morphological co-adaptations. 20. Ornithophilous flowers need to be conspicuous to birds. 20. Birds have their greatest spectral sensitivity and finest hue discrimination at the red end of the visual spectrum. 20. So red is particularly conspicuous to them. Hummingbirds may also be able to see ultraviolet colors. The prevalence of ultraviolet patterns in nectar guides in nectar-poor entomophilous, insect-pollinated flowers warns the bird to avoid these flowers. 20. Each of the two subfamilies of hummingbirds, the Phaethornithinae hermits and the Trochilinae, has evolved in conjunction with a particular set of flowers. Most Phaethornithinae species are associated with large monocotyledonous herbs, while the Trochilinae prefer dicotyledonous plant species. 20. Fig reproduction and fig wasps. A fig exposing its many tiny matured, seed-bearing gynoecia. These are pollinated by the fig wasp. Blastophaga psns. In the cultivated fig, there are also asexual varieties. 24. The genus Ficus is composed of 800 species of vines, shrubs, and trees, including the cultivated fig, defined by their syconia, the fruit-like vessels that either hold female flowers or pollen on the inside. Each fig species has its own fig wasp which, in most cases, pollinates the fig, so tight mutual dependence has evolved and persisted throughout the genus. 24. Pseudomyrmex ant on Bullthorn Fachelia cornigera, with Beltian bodies that provide the ants with protein. 25. Acacia ants and acacias. The acacia ant, Pseudomyrmex ferruginea, is an obligate plant ant that protects at least 5 species of Acacia, Fachelia, from preying insects and from other plants competing for sunlight, and the tree provides nourishment and shelter for the ant and its larvae. 25. 26. Such mutualism is not automatic. Other ant species exploit trees without reciprocating, following different evolutionary strategies. These cheater ants impose important host costs via damage to tree reproductive organs, though their net effect on host fitness is not necessarily negative and, thus, becomes difficult to forecast. 27. 28. Hosts and parasites. Parasites and sexually reproducing hosts. Host-parasite coevolution is the coevolution of a host and a parasite. 29. A general characteristic of many viruses, as obligate parasites, is that they coevolved alongside their respective hosts. Correlated mutations between the two species enter them into an evolution arms race. Whichever organism, host or parasite, that cannot keep up with the other will be eliminated from their habitat, as the species with the higher average population fitness survives. This race is known as the Red Queen hypothesis. 30. The Red Queen hypothesis predicts that sexual reproduction allows a host to stay just ahead of its parasite, similar to the Red Queen's race in Through the Looking Glass. It takes all the running you can do, to keep in the same place. 31. The host reproduces sexually, producing some offspring with immunity over its parasite, which then evolves in response. 32. The parasite-host relationship probably drove the prevalence of sexual reproduction over the more efficient asexual reproduction. It seems that when a parasite infects a host, sexual reproduction affords a better chance of developing resistance through variation in the next generation, giving sexual reproduction variability for fitness not seen in the asexual reproduction, which produces another generation of the organism susceptible to infection by the same parasite. 33, 34, 35 Coevolution between host and parasite may accordingly be responsible for much of the genetic diversity seen in normal populations, including blood plasma polymorphism, protein polymorphism, and histocompatibility systems. 36. Brood parasite, Eurasian reed warbler raising a common cuckoo. 37. Brood parasites. Brood parasitism demonstrates close coevolution of host and parasite, for example in some cuckoos. These birds do not make their own nests, but lay their eggs in nests of other species, ejecting or killing the eggs and young of the host and thus having a strong negative impact on the host's reproductive fitness. Their eggs are camouflaged as eggs of their hosts, implying that hosts can distinguish their own eggs from those of intruders and are in an evolutionary arms race with the cuckoo between camouflage and recognition. Cuckoos are counter-adapted to host defenses with features such as thickened eggshells, shorter incubation, so their young hatch first, and flat backs adapted to lift eggs out of the nest. 37, 38, 39. Antagonistic coevolution. Antagonistic coevolution is seen in the harvester ant species Paganomyrmex barbatus and Paganomyrmex rugosus, in a relationship both parasitic and mutualistic. The queens are unable to produce worker ants by mating with their own species. Only by crossbreeding can they produce workers. The winged females act as parasites for the males of the other species as their sperm will only produce sterile hybrids. But because the colonies are fully dependent on these hybrids to survive, it is also mutualistic. While there is no genetic exchange between the species, they are unable to evolve in a direction where they become too genetically different as this would make crossbreeding impossible. 40. Predators and prey. Predator and prey, a leopard killing a bushbuck. Predators and prey interact and coevolve, the predator to catch the prey more effectively, the prey to escape. The coevolution of the two mutually imposes selective pressures. These often lead to an evolutionary arms race between prey and predator, resulting in anti-predator adaptations. 41. The same applies to herbivores, animals that eat plants, and the plants that they eat. Paul R. Ehrlich and Peter H. Raven in 1964 proposed the theory of escape and radiate coevolution to describe the evolutionary diversification of plants and butterflies. 42. In the Rocky Mountains, red squirrels and crossbills, seed-eating birds, compete for seeds of the lodgepole pine. The squirrels get at pine seeds by gnawing through the cone scales, whereas the crossbills get at the seeds by extracting them with their unusual crossed mandibles. In areas where there are squirrels, the lodgepole's cones are heavier, and have fewer seeds and thinner scales, making it more difficult for squirrels to get at the seeds. Conversely, where there are crossbills but no squirrels, the cones are lighter in construction, but have thicker scales, making it more difficult for crossbills to get at the seeds. The lodgepole's cones are in an evolutionary arms race with the two kinds of herbivore. 43. Sexual conflict has been studied in Drosophila melanogaster, shown mating, male on right. Competition. Both interspecific competition, with features such as sexual conflict 44 and sexual selection 45 and interspecific competition, such as between predators, may be able to drive coevolution. 46. Interspecific competition can result in sexual antagonistic coevolution, an evolutionary relationship analogous to an arms race, where the evolutionary fitness of the sexes is counteracted to achieve maximum reproductive success. For example, some insects reproduce using traumatic insemination, which is disadvantageous to the female's health. During mating, males try to maximize their fitness by inseminating as many females as possible, but the more times a female's abdomen is punctured, the less likely she is to survive, reducing her fitness. 47. Multispecies. Long-tongued bees and long-tubed flowers coevolved, whether pairwise or diffusely, in groups known as guilds. 48. The types of coevolution listed so far have been described as if they operated pairwise, also called specific coevolution, in which traits of one species have evolved in direct response to traits of a second species, and vice versa. This is not always the case. Another evolutionary mode arises where evolution is reciprocal, but is among a group of species rather than exactly two. This is variously called guild or diffuse coevolution. For instance, a trait in several species of flowering plant, such as offering its nectar at the end of a long tube, can coevolve with a trait in one or several species of pollinating insects, such as a long proboscis. More generally, flowering plants are pollinated by insects from different families including bees, flies, and beetles, all of which form a broad guild of pollinators which respond to the nectar or pollen produced by flowers. 48, 49, 50. Geographic mosaic theory. Mosaic coevolution is a theory in which geographic location and community ecology shape differing coevolution between strongly interacting species in multiple populations. These populations may be separated by space and/or time. Depending on the ecological conditions, the interspecific interactions may be mutualistic or antagonistic. 51. In mutualisms, both partners benefit from the interaction, whereas one partner generally experiences decreased fitness in antagonistic interactions. Arms races consist of two species adapting ways to one-up the other. Several factors affect these relationships, including hot spots, cold spots, and trait mixing. 52. Reciprocal selection occurs when a change in one partner puts pressure on the other partner to change in response. Hot spots are areas of strong reciprocal selection, while cold spots are areas with no reciprocal selection or where only one partner is present. 52. The three constituents of geographic structure that contribute to this particular type of coevolution are natural selection in the form of a geographic mosaic, hot spots often surrounded by cold spots, and trait remixing by means of genetic drift and gene flow. 52. Mosaic, along with general coevolution, most commonly occurs at the population level and is driven by both the biotic and the abiotic environment. These environmental factors can constrain coevolution and affect how far it can escalate. 53. Outside biology. Coevolution is primarily a biological concept, but has been applied to other fields by analogy. In algorithms. Coevolutionary algorithms are used for generating artificial life as well as for optimization, game learning and machine learning. 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. Daniel Hillis added, co-evolving parasites, to prevent an optimization procedure from becoming stuck at local maxima. 59. Carl Sims co-evolved virtual creatures. 60. In architecture. The concept of coevolution was introduced in architecture by the Danish architect-urbanist Henrik Weyler as an antithesis to star architecture. 61. As the curator of the Danish Pavilion at the 2006 Venice Biennale of Architecture, he created an exhibition project on coevolution in urban development in China. It won the Golden Lion for Best National Pavilion. 62, 63, 64, 65. At the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, Newcastle University, a coevolutionary approach to architecture has been defined as a design practice that engages students, volunteers and members of the local community in practical, experimental work aimed at establishing dynamic processes of learning between users and designers. 66. In cosmology and astronomy. In his book The Self-Organizing Universe, Eric Jantz attributed the entire evolution of the cosmos to coevolution. In astronomy, an emerging theory proposes that black holes and galaxies develop in an interdependent way analogous to biological coevolution. 67. In management and organization studies. Since year 2000, a growing number of management and organization studies discuss coevolution and coevolutionary processes. Even so, Abaticola LL. 2020 reveals a prevailing scarcity in explaining what processes substantially characterize coevolution in these fields, meaning that specific analyses about where this perspective on socioeconomic changes, and where it could move toward in the future, are still missing. 68. In sociology. In Development Betrayed, The End of Progress and a Coevolutionary Revisioning of the Future, 1994, 69, Richard Norgaard proposes a coevolutionary cosmology to explain how social and environmental systems influence and reshape each other. 70. In Coevolutionary Economics, The Economy, Society and the Environment, 1994, John Gowdy suggests that the economy, society, and the environment are linked together in a coevolutionary relationship. 71. In Technology, computer software and hardware can be considered as two separate components but tied intrinsically by coevolution. Similarly, operating systems and computer applications, web browsers, and web applications. All these systems depend upon each other and advance through a kind of evolutionary process. Changes in hardware, an operating system or web browser may introduce new features that are then incorporated into the corresponding applications running alongside. 72. The idea is closely related to the concept of joint optimization in socio-technical systems analysis and design, where a system is understood to consist of both a technical system, encompassing the tools and hardware used for production and maintenance, and a social system, of relationships and procedures through which the technology is tied into the goals of the system and all the other human and organizational relationships within and outside the system. Such systems work best when the technical and social systems are deliberately developed together. Co-adaptation. In biology, co-adaptation is the process by which two or more species, genes or phenotypic traits undergo adaptation as a pair or group. This occurs when two or more interacting characteristics undergo natural selection together in response to the same selective pressure or when selective pressures alter one characteristic and consecutively alter the interactive characteristic. These interacting characteristics are only beneficial when together, sometimes leading to increased interdependence. Co-adaptation and coevolution, although similar in process, are not the same. Co-adaptation refers to the interactions between two units, whereas coevolution refers to their evolutionary history. Co-adaptation and its examples are often seen as evidence for coevolution. 1. Genes and protein complexes. At genetic level, co-adaptation is the accumulation of interacting genes in the gene pool of a population by selection. Selection pressures on one of the genes will affect its interacting proteins, after which compensatory changes occur. 2. 1. Proteins often act in complex interactions with other proteins and functionally related proteins often show a similar evolutionary path. 1. 3. A possible explanation is co-adaptation. 1. An example of this is the interaction between proteins encoded by mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and nuclear DNA, nDNA. mtDNA has a higher rate of evolution, mutation than nDNA, especially in specific coding regions. 2. 3. However, in order to maintain physiological functionality, selection for functionally interacting proteins, and therefore co-adapted nDNA will be favorable. 2. Co-adaptation between mtDNA and nDNA sequences has been studied in the copod Tigriopus californicus. 2. The mtDNA of COII coding sequences among conspecific populations of this species diverges extensively. 2. When mtDNA of one population was placed in a nuclear background of another population, cytochrome C oxidase activity is significantly decreased, suggesting co-adaptation. Results show an unlikely relationship between the variation in mtDNA and environmental factors. A more likely explanation is the neutral evolution of mtDNA with compensatory changes by the nDNA driven by neutral evolution of mtDNA, random mutations over time in isolated populations. 2. Bacteria and bacteriophage. Gene blocks in bacterial genomes are sequences of genes, co-located on the chromosome, that are evolutionarily conserved across numerous taxa. 4. Some conserved blocks are operons, where the genes are co-transcribed to polycistronic mRNA, and such operons are often associated with a single function such as a metabolic pathway or a protein complex. 4. The co-location of genes with related function and the preservation of these relationships over evolutionary time indicates that natural selection has been operating to maintain a co-adaptive benefit. As the early mapping of genes on the bacteriophage T4 chromosome progressed, it became evident that the arrangement of the genes is far from random. 5 genes with like functions tend to fall into clusters and appear to be co-adapted to each other. For instance, genes that specify proteins employed in bacteriophage head morphogenesis are tightly clustered. 6 other examples of apparently co-adapted clusters are the genes that determine the baseplate wedge, the tail fibers, and DNA polymerase accessory proteins. 6. In other cases where the structural relationship of the gene products is not as evident, a co-adapted clustering based on functional interaction may also occur. Thus Aubringer, 7, proposed that a specific cluster of genes, centered around the IMM and SPACL genes encodes proteins adapted for competition and defense at the DNA level. Organs. Similar to traits on a genetic level, aspects of organs can also be subject to co-adaptation. For example, slender bones can have similar performance in regards to bearing daily loads as thicker bones, due to slender bones having more mineralized tissue. This means that slenderness and the level of mineralization have probably been co-adapted. However, due to being harder than thick bones, slender bones are generally less pliant and more prone to breakage, especially when subjected to more extreme load conditions. 8. Weakly electric fish are capable of creating a weak electric field using an electric organ. These electric fields can be used to communicate between individuals through electric organ discharges, EOD, which can be further modulated to create context-specific signals called chirps. Fish can sense these electric fields and signals using electroreceptors. Research on ghost knifefish 9 indicates that the signals produced by electric fish and the way they are received might be CO-adapted, as the environment in which the fish resides, both physical and social, influences selection for the chirps, EODs, and detection. Interactions between territorial fish favor different signal parameters than interactions within social groups of fish. Evolutionary biology portal. The behavior of parents and their offspring during feeding is influenced by one another. Parents feed depending on how much their offspring begs, while the offspring begs depending on how hungry it is. This would normally lead to a conflict of interest between parent and offspring, as the offspring will want to be fed as much as possible, whereas the parent can only invest a limited amount of energy into parental care. As such, selection would occur for the combination of begging and feeding behaviors that leads to the highest fitness, resulting in co-adaptation. 10. Parent-offspring co-adaptation can be further influenced by information asymmetry, such as female blue tits being exposed more to begging behavior in nature, resulting in them responding more than males to similar levels of stimuli. 11. It is also possible for related traits to only partially co-adapt due to traits not developing at the same speed, or contradict each other entirely. Research on Australian skinks 12 revealed that diurnal skinks have a high temperature preference and can sprint optimally at higher temperatures, while nocturnal skinks have a low preferred temperature and optimum temperature. However, the differences between high and low optimal temperatures were much smaller than between preferred temperatures, which means that nocturnal skinks sprint slower compared to their diurnal counterparts. In the case of Aramyoscincus, the optimum temperature and preferred temperature diverged from one another in opposite directions, creating antagonistic co-adaptation. Evolution 1. David adaptation. In biology, co-adaptation is the process by which two or more species, genes or phenotypic traits undergo adaptation as a pair or group. This occurs when two or more interacting characteristics undergo natural selection together in response to the same selective pressure or when selective pressures alter one characteristic and consecutively alter the interactive characteristic. These interacting characteristics are only beneficial when together, sometimes leading to increased interdependence. Co-adaptation and coevolution, although similar in process, are not the same. Co-adaptation refers to the interactions between two units, whereas coevolution refers to their evolutionary history. Co-adaptation and its examples are often seen as evidence for coevolution. Bacteria and bacteriophage. Gene blocks in bacterial genomes are sequences of genes, co-located on the chromosome, that are evolutionarily conserved across numerous taxa. 4. Some conserved blocks are operons, where the genes are co-transcribed to polycistronic mRNA, and such operons are often associated with a single function such as a metabolic pathway or a protein complex. 4. The co-location of genes with related function and the preservation of these relationships over evolutionary time indicates that natural selection has been operating to maintain a co-adaptive benefit. As the early mapping of genes on the bacteriophage T4 chromosome progressed, it became evident that the arrangement of the genes is far from random. 5 genes with like functions tend to fall into clusters and appear to be co-adapted to each other. For instance, genes that specify proteins employed in bacteriophage head morphogenesis are tightly clustered. 6 other examples of apparently co-adapted clusters are the genes that determine the baseplate wedge, the tail fibers, and DNA polymerase accessory proteins. 6. In other cases where the structural relationship of the gene products is not as evident, a co-adapted clustering based on functional interaction may also occur. Thus Aubringer 7 proposed that a specific cluster of genes, centered around the IMM and SPACL genes encodes proteins adapted for competition and defense at the DNA level. Organs. Similar to traits on a genetic level, aspects of organs can also be subject to co-adaptation. For example, slender bones can have similar performance in regards to bearing daily loads as thicker bones, due to slender bones having more mineralized tissue. This means that slenderness and the level of mineralization have probably been co-adapted. However, due to being harder than thick bones, slender bones are generally less pliant and more prone to breakage, especially when subjected to more extreme load. Genes and protein complexes. At genetic level, co-adaptation is the accumulation of interacting genes in the gene pool of a population by selection. Selection pressures on one of the genes will affect its interacting proteins, after which compensatory changes occur. 2. 1. Proteins often act in complex interactions with other proteins and functionally related proteins often show a similar evolutionary path. 1. 3. A possible explanation is co-adaptation. 1. An example of this is the interaction between proteins encoded by mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, and nuclear DNA, nDNA. mtDNA has a higher rate of evolution mutation than nDNA, especially in specific coding regions. 2. 3. However, in order to maintain physiological functionality, selection for functionally interacting proteins, and therefore co-adapted nDNA will be favorable. 2. Co-adaptation between mtDNA and nDNA sequences has been studied in the copod Tigriopus californicus. 2. The mtDNA of COII coding sequences among conspecific populations of this species diverges extensively. 2. When mtDNA of one population was placed in a nuclear background of another population, cytochrome C oxidase activity is significantly decreased, suggesting co-adaptation. Results show an unlikely relationship between the variation in mtDNA and environmental factors. A more likely explanation is the neutral evolution of mtDNA with compensatory changes by the nDNA driven by neutral evolution of mtDNA, random mutations over time in isolated populations. 2. Bacteria and bacteriophage. For example, slender bones can have similar performance in regards to bearing daily loads as thicker bones, due to slender bones having more mineralized tissue. This means that slenderness and the level of mineralization have probably been co-adapted. However, due to being harder than thick bones, slender bones are generally less pliant and more prone to breakage, especially when subjected to more extreme load conditions. 8. Weakly electric fish are capable of creating a weak electric field using an electric organ. Evolutionary biology portal. The behavior of parents and their offspring during feeding is influenced. Research. It is also possible for related traits to only partially co-adapt due to traits not developing at the same speed, or contradict each other entirely. Research on Australian skinks 12 revealed that diurnal skinks have a high temperature preference and can sprint optimally at higher temperatures, while nocturnal skinks have a low preferred temperature and optimum temperature. However, the differences between high and low optimal temperatures were much smaller than between preferred temperatures,